What's up guys, it's Izuu here, welcome back to Yugioh, Deck of the Day. Today we're taking a look at the deck that got pretty much destroyed in the ban list. We all know that Izuu tier had it coming, but I'm sure a lot of people still are kind of curious about what the deck can do after the ban list because it's been such a long time since we've seen a deck get destroyed this hard. For example, decks like Spirals or Dragon Rulers were only examples I can think of that were decks that got so many hits, and tier got them all at once. All these other decks, they were kept getting hit like for 2 to 3 ban lists. This deck, everything got pretty much neutered at once. So now let's try and see what the deck can do post ban list. And let me tell you already, the deck is not dead like a lot of people think, just because of how good these cards are. Even at 1, that you can just supplement with little tweaks here and there, and you can actually have a really decent deck. Of course, it's not going to be anything like it used to be, and it's going to be a lot more RNG based than before, but still, for those who enjoyed the deck before and are trying to pick it up for the upcoming format, you can still do some cool things, and there are some other different variants you can play. I'm going to show you some more examples when we get to the list, but this is the list that I've come up with for the upcoming format. So before we begin the video, if you enjoyed, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the deck profile. So let's start with the tier monsters. First we have one copy of Rhinoheart. Now this is the only card that is not at 1, it's still at 3, but the thing is, we do have a much better normal summon for the deck now that we can abuse because the Izuu cards got hit to 1 as well. So this card you hardly ever want to normal summon. Mainly you want to be summoning with its own effect, either by milling it or sending it directly to the graveyard to get another name. So yeah, it's a card that basically adds another tier name to the mix, and it's not something you really look to for normal summon. And for the other names, we have of course one copy of Sharin, one copy of Havnis, and one copy of Merely. Now all of these are at 1 now, and them being at 1 means a couple things. First of all, you're not going to be milling them as consistently, so you need to be able to search them, because just per Arena on its own, it's not enough to search all of these cards. So we do incorporate other engines and other cards that specifically make us able to search these cards in our hand, so we can send them to the grave, like Shiren's effect or the other cards, to be able to get a lot of mills, a lot of effects. So yeah, these cards, they're so powerful that even when at 1, they can still function really well. They do rely a little bit more on luck than before, because it was really unfair when they were all at 3, so you were milling them pretty much every single time, at least one of them guaranteed. So yeah, these cards being at 1, perfectly understandable in Konami's part. The deck really needed the severe hits, but again, the deck can still function even with those hits. Now we have one of the new cards that we got in Font Hypernova, which is 3 copies of Tearlements Kashtira. Now this card actually fixes a lot of issues that the deck would have without it, because basically it adds 3 more Havnis to the mix. So this is a card that it doesn't mill. It's pretty much like a card that you can mill from both decks, but this card mills only from your deck. It's like basically a Kelbeck or Yugioh for just you, because it has 2 different milling effects. So being able to mill 3 for the first time, and then you get an extra mill too if this card is sent to the grave by a card effect. So you do have ways to be able to get more mills. It doesn't fusion summon, which sucks, because it would have been really good if she could do that as well, just like the other tiers. But again, all of these effects with basically the mills you have means that you are going to see the cards you want in your graveyard eventually. We do play a lot of cards that help us get more access to our Izuu cards, and also help us draw our deck and send the cards we need to the graveyard to be able to see the combo pieces. And once you get to see those combo pieces, the boards this deck can make are still insane. They are not as easy to make because Kit Kalos is also banned, so you need to play other cards to supplement for that, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Now moving on to the Izuu cards. First we have one copy of Mudora and one copy of Keldo. These are our shufflers. Those being on 1 means that if you see them in your hand, you don't have enough Earth Fairy monsters to discard for them. So we are trying to make that work a little bit better, because drawing these cards without the millers means that they're basically dead cards. You are never going to normal summon a Mudora or a Keldo, so you need to either send them to the graveyard with an effect like Shiren or something like that, or you need to be able to summon them with their own effect. But again, with only 4 Earth Fairies in the deck, it would be really difficult, so we're playing another engine that is going to help with that as well. And of course we have one copy of Kelbeck and one copy of Yugioh. These cards are the millers. They're still as broken as ever, because you have another card that's basically the normal summon I mentioned, which we're going to show right after, which is the card that can send these directly to the graveyard, so you can get to mill 5 cards. You can recycle them if you want with Mudora and Keldo, so you can potentially use them again. And of course Kelbeck is an amazing hand drop if you draw it, so it's another disruption like that on its own. The normal summon of the deck is 3 copies of Diviner of the Heralds. Now when the Izuu engine was super consistent, everything at 3, this card was an option, but it was not something people were really keen on playing, because it felt like it was unnecessary. That's pretty much it. So Rhinoheart was much better, but now that both Kelbeck and Yugioh are at 1, this card is so good, because you can send the millers directly to the graveyard. You get a level 6 tuner on the field that mills you 5 cards, potentially fusing, potentially milling even more depending on your luck, but also being a level 6 tuner means means that you can use it for a couple things. For example, after you special summon a level 4 monster, either by summoning a Mudora or a Yugioh or by fusing into Madragon, you can go into Baron de Flor, which is an amazing boss monster, so she does so much for the deck now that all of these hits are amassed together. We're playing 3 copies of King of the Swamp. This card is basically mandatory now. It's a card that some people were playing like at 1 copy before, but now that Kit Kalos is banned, you cannot summon Rule Kalos without this card. You need something to substitute for the name that is basically missing from the deck because of the ban. So this card, not only is it a card that is going to get you to your big boss monsters once you send to the grave to fuse, but also you can pitch it to search a polymerization, which is kind of a last resort play. Resolving polymerization in this deck doesn't feel great, but it's something that the deck can do in case you have some awkward hands in order to be able to resolve more effects, so you need play poly as well, just for that scenario. We are playing 1 copy of Shadoll Beast. Yes, we are back in the Shadoll engine, and even though we are playing only 1 copy of Shadolls, the mills that the deck does, even with the hits, it's still really, really good. So you're going to hit this 1 beast eventually, and you're always going to be recycling it back with your Tearlaments, so not only are you going to be drawing a card, but you're going to be summoning your boss monsters really easy. And this card also, being a dark spellcaster, means that you can summon Madragon of the Swamp really, really easily with this card, because all the Tearlaments are aqua monsters, so you need different attributes, so you need a different type with the same attribute, so this card helps with that as well. Now, the engine that I think makes the deck really, really good, but there are some other solutions. Before I show it to you, I can already tell you, I am not playing any generic Kashtira cards to search Tearlement Kashtira. We are not playing the field spell, we're not playing Fenrir. I feel like if you start putting so many Kashtira cards in the deck, you make the deck more Kashtira than Tearlaments, so you might as well play pure Kashtira at this point, because it's just a much better deck right now. But the engine, I feel like, makes the deck like still having its own identity while also helping immensely, is the FLUFFAL engine. So we have 3 copies of FLUFFAL Bear. Now, pretty much you already know that this engine is mainly a draw engine. We're going to use Toy Vendor and FLUFFAL Wings in order to draw so many cards. But there are a couple functions that this engine has that helps so much. So first of all, FLUFFAL Bear is an Earth Fairy monster. So it's a card that if you see it in your hand with a Mudora or a Yugioh, you can pitch it to summon them to the field, so you can use them for synchro plays or Xyz plays, which again I mentioned, it's something that the deck cannot really do with the Izuu cards. Now that they're at 1, it's very unlikely that you're going to see 2 of them in your hand when you only play 4. So this card, basically, we play now 7 Earth Fairy monsters, so you have more targets to pitch. So this card does so much. On top of that, we all know that Toy Vendor is a card that gets effect when it's sent to the graveyard, so the more cards you add into the deck that can give you pluses, the more you mill, makes the deck more consistent, because if you have too many cards that do nothing in the graveyard when they get milled, and you get a little bit unlucky with your mills, basically you don't advance your game state at all. So the FLUFFAL engine is going to give you more mill targets, it's going to give you draw power, and it's going to give you something to pitch for your Mudora and your Yugioh. We have 2 copies of FLUFFAL Wings. Unfortunately, this card is a light monster. If it was an Earth as well, it would have been a target to pitch for Mudora and Yugioh, and maybe it would have been considered to be a 3-of just because of that alone. But again, because it's not a card you can pitch for these cards, you kind of don't have to play 3, and you don't really need to play 3 because you just need 1 in the graveyard, and then you can banish it with your FLUFFAL Bear along with one of your Toy Vendors to get through 2 cards, and then you're going to search another FLUFFAL Bear, which is going to give you the discard you need for your Izuu cards. For the spell cards, we have 3 copies of Pearl Rhino. This card, being a 3, gives the deck hope. If this card was hit at 1 along with everything else, then I just don't think the deck would even be worth considering for the upcoming format. But because this card is still a 3, gives you a consistency boost, and it also gives you removal, which is really important. Being able to use your graveyard effects during your opponent's turn, even with fusing or with just Mudora and Yugioh to pop more cards, gives the deck more disruptions. So it's a really powerful field spell, and I'm glad it's a 3, because if it wasn't, then the deck would be pretty much dead. We're playing 3 copies of Foolish Burial Goods. This deck can pretty much use this card very consistently. The problem was that, again, it was a card that felt very unnecessary when everything was at 3. It's a card that gives you a search by sending a Salik to the graveyard, or if you want to search a trap, you can send the Scream, or of course, with this particular build, you can send Toy Vendor and search your Bear if that's what you need. So this card is a lot of good stuff for the deck. So it's a card that you have to play at 3 now, because again, your mills are not going to be consistent, so you need to send the cards you need to the graveyard specifically sometimes. We're playing 3 copies of Toy Vendor. We've already talked about that, but I'm going to talk about it again. This card is amazing. This whole engine is really good for the deck. When you mill this card, you get a search, and again, when you use your Wings effect in the graveyard, this card is again going to give you a search. So it's not like you have to discard the 1 target you have to pitch for Mudora and Yugioh to the grave to set this card to do the draw combo, because again, after you do the draw combo, you're going to search another Bear, so you're always going to have a target for them. So yeah, this card, good mill target, good engine overall, giving you draws, giving you the cards you need. So yeah, I love this engine in the deck. We have 2 copies of Tearlement Scream. This is another card that can help you mill both cards during both turns, and also giving you access to your trap cards more easily when you mill it, while lowering your opponent's monster's attack points as well, which is a really good added bonus. And for the 1-ups, we play 1 copy of Polymerization because, again, we are playing King of the Swamp, and because we are maxing King of the Swamp, this card being at 1 means that not only are we going to have an extra fusion effect that we can use, but we can also put King of the Swamp in the graveyard, which is where we want it to be because we want to be using it to fuse with the Tearlements to go into some powerful monsters. We have 1 copy of Foolish Burial, self-explanatory, we are playing Tear, and 1 copy of Terraforming to search for the Rhino. And for the trap cards, we have 2 copies of Salik. Again, we're playing more than 1 because we want to mill it. Sometimes I was considering playing 3 copies of this card, just because it searches a Tearlament monster when it's sent to the graveyard, but again, this card would have been a bit too bricky at 3, because if you draw more than 1 copy, there is nothing you can do with them, and there's not really an easy way to send them to the graveyard unless you have Rhino Heart. So yeah, I feel like it would be too bricky at 3. At 2, it feels really, really good, being able to still mill it while getting a search, while also using its permanence effect to use it as disruption during your opponent's turn. And we have 1 copy of Meta Noise. This is another card that you can use for another disruption, and also if it's under the grave, it can recycle a Tearlament from your graveyard, so it's even more searchability that you can use for your cards. For the extra deck, we have 1 copy of Rule Kalos. This card, because of King of the Swamp, it's still a thing. Some people were thinking that without Kid Kalos, this card was not going to be a good boss monster. It's still an amazing card, being able to negate summons, and it's still fairly easy to summon because of King of the Swamp, so it's a card we're definitely playing. We're playing 1 copy of Kaleido Heart, again another really good card. It's not very easy to summon now because we don't have too many tiers. Kashtira Tearlement fixes that just a little bit, but we still don't have nearly as many as we used to. It's still a monster, it's going to come up, especially during the grand games when you have a graveyard full of cards, but during the early game, it's like very difficult to summon this turn 1 sometimes, especially because we're playing 1 Rhino Heart. If you were playing more copies of Rhino Heart, then yes, it would be more easy, but I just don't feel like it's worth playing, just because Diviner is such a much better normal summon. We have 1 copy of Shadoll Winda, because we're playing Shadoll Beast, we can use this card to lock out opponent after special summoning, which again, a lot of decks cannot deal with a card like this. We're playing 1 copy of Grapha, Dragon Overlord of Dark World. Now, the reason we can use the boss monster, the new boss monster of Dark Worlds, is because of King of the Swamp. This card normally requires Grapha and a dark monster, but because of King of the Swamp, you can substitute Grapha, and you play so many dark monsters anyway, so you can summon this card very, very easily, which is another really good card that can basically negate anything and turn the effect into you discarding a card. So if you discard a card like, for example, a Toy Vendor, a Tear, or even one of the Spells or Traps, you can get a plus off of that. So it's not like a neg when you use an effect like this, because it was meant for Dark Worlds, but the deck feels very similar, where you get so many effects when you send cards to the graveyard, so this card works really, really well as well. We play 1 copy of Dragostapelia, being able to recycle our fusion monsters while also getting a disruption on board, and 1 copy of Madragon of the Swamp, because sometimes you need like level 4 in order to go into Baron with your Diviner, or you can go into a rank 4 with like a Mudora or a Keldo, so it's another good fusion target. The only synchro monster we play is 1 copy of Baron de Flor. Because we play Diviner, this card is actually fairly easy to summon, mainly because of Madragon, because if we were not playing Madragon, again, we would kind of have to rely on Mudora and Keldo being consistent, which are a bit more consistent because of Bear, but again, they're not super consistent, so we can make this card in myriad of ways. For the Xyz monsters, we play 1 copy of Abyss Dweller, because there will be again some matchups, not nearly as many as before, because you're not going to be able to see mirror matches like a lot. In the first few weeks of the new format, you're going to be seeing a lot of mirror matches because people are experimenting with the deck to see exactly how they can potentially make it playable, but again, there are a lot of other decks that can rely on the graveyard, so even after a while, Dweller is always going to have value. We have 1 copy of Baguska. This card is here for the scenarios that your hands are really, really awkward, you cannot do much or your opponent disrupted you to oblivion, so you at least can make this card potentially get your turn back. We play 1 copy of Redoer. This is a card that can trigger the Tearlaments. It detaches during your opponent's turn, so you can use this card to get more fusions during your opponent's turn. And we also play 1 copy of Zeus, because we're playing Xyz monsters, so we can throw it on top of any of them that battled, and then we can clear our opponent's board. For the Link monsters, we have 1 copy of Dark Charmer. Even though Izuu tier is not going to be nearly as relevant, the Dark attribute is so generic that even though we are not going to be seeing a good Dark monster in our opponent's graveyard every single game like last format, it's still an amazing card to play just because of how generic Darks are, so we can always steal some good with it. We're playing 1 copy of Sprite Sprint. This card can help you get your Merlin in the graveyard, so it's another good card to get you a guaranteed name in the grave. 1 copy of Access Code Togger for when we go in second and we spam a lot of monsters, because this deck again can still get a lot of monsters on the board, so you can destroy your opponent's board and go for game. And 1 copy of Underworld Goddess, so we don't lose to cards that are unaffected or anything like that, because again, the deck now has enough room in the extra deck to be able to play cards like this, so why not play them? Because if we don't, we might lose some matchups that we wouldn't if this card was on extra. So yep, that's the deck, guys. Again, you can play a more Kashtira version if you want of the deck that would work, be able to search your Tearlaments Kashtira with Fenrir or stuff like that, but I tried to make the deck as similar to the old archetype that it was, because again, I feel like if you're playing so many Kashtira cards, why not play Kashtira? Because the deck is going to be the best deck of the format, unlike this deck, which is going to be like a roguish strategy at this point. But yeah, I just feel like the deck was so fun to play sometimes. times that I just could not let it go. I know that it was unfair to a lot of people, and I'm so glad that it got hit the way it did because it was so unfair. But again, we are not going to let it die so easily. We're going to try to make it work, and I just feel like this build is actually good enough for me to the point of being playable again. So yep, that's the video, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos, and we'll see you next time.